A quick content note. This episode includes discussion of sensitive topics, including depression and suicidal thoughts. While the conversation is not graphic or detailed, these themes are addressed openly. You may wish to skip from around 15 minutes to around 23 minutes if you prefer not to listen to that part of the episode. If the issues raised in this episode concern you, you can access support and resources in the show notes.
Welcome to the Research Culture Uncovered podcast, where in every episode we explore what is research culture and what should it be. You'll hear thoughts and opinions from a range of contributors to help you change research culture into what you want it to be.
Welcome to the Research Culture Uncovered podcast. I'm Taryn Bell, a Researcher Development Advisor at the University of Leeds. Back in December 2024, we released an episode focusing on failure in academia. We talked about the narratives around failure, who's allowed to fail, and the need to be more open about our failures. If you haven't listened to that, I'd really encourage you to go back and have a listen after today's episode, and we'll include a link in the show notes. Since then, we've heard from many listeners who've said that this message resonated with them, and many of them expressed relief that this is something that we're talking about openly. So with that in mind, today we're going to continue our journey into the realm of failure to see what we learn from sharing our experiences. I'm really glad to be joined today by my colleague and co-host Jed Hall, who's here to share his own experiences. Welcome, Jed. Is this your first time on the podcast as a guest, not a host?
Yes, it is. Yeah, first time kind of being interviewed on my own. Yeah. Going back to that, going back to your intro and saying that episode was really fundamental in me moving, final stages of me moving on from this story that the listeners are about to hear.
So hopefully then today will be a little bit cathartic, maybe for you, give you a chance to kind of put the final pieces in place, so to speak, on that experience. So just as a little context for any new listeners who are new to the podcast, could you give us a quick insight into your current role at Leeds?
Yeah, so I'm an academic development consultant in organisational development and professional learning at the university. So my kind of focus for my role is research impact. I'll do a plug for the playlist. I'm sure you'll put that in the show notes for me. So I deliver a whole range of development provision. It's not really training, development provision around impact, and that also includes individual coaching as well as cohort programs.
I don't want to embarrass you, but I think from knowing you and working with you, you've had a very successful career in research development. And I think from the outside, it's often very easy to look at other people's careers and successes and high points without realizing that it's not all been plain sailing. In this episode, you're going to share one experience of professional failure, which happened a few years ago. Could you tell us a little bit more?
Yeah, so in lead into the pandemic, I started a 2-day-a-week organisational development project for Professor Nick Plant. So he's now our Pro Vice Chancellor for Research and Innovation, but back then he was Dean of Research Quality and Impact. And the project was around coming up with a university-wide strategy to embed research impact within the academic experience, actually within the university, and to prevent it being driven, that culture being driven by the research excellence framework, which is the research assessment exercise in the UK. So kind of jumping forward a little bit, I've been working for Nick on that 2-day-a-week project for about 18 months or so. And then it was kind of early evening, so I'd kind of just shut down the laptop. We were all at home in that period. So I was sat on the couch and I got a message on Teams from Nick saying, can we have just a short chat? So I thought, must be something quite important. So he was actually just telling me that he'd been successful in applying for the PVC role. It was at that time called a deputy vice chancellor role. So he was just telling me that he'd been successful and that there'd be a kind of handover period while he, as the boss of his old role, would work out what he wanted next from that role. But it was clear criteria given to him by the appointment committee that he would have to hand over that responsibility. Now that was kind of tough for Nick, because one of the things that he's really passionate about is research impact, which is why I've really enjoyed working for him all this time, and I've really enjoyed him being DVC and PVC for research innovation, because I know he believes in the same things I believe in. So anyway, the role was advertised. His old role was advertised, and it was actually advertised in a very different way. So it came out as Director of Knowledge Exchange and Impact. So that kind of opens up a couple of things in my head. First of all, it's not a dean role, which traditionally feels like a role that only an academic can apply for. So because it's labelled director, that kind of feels, this could be something I could go for. Now, I'm currently a grade 8 at Leeds in terms of our grading structures. I'm at the top of that grade. I've been at the top of that grade since I came here, because I was actually on a higher grade at my old institution. So I took a kind of step down in grade to come to Leeds. And the director is a grade 10 role, so it's quite a big jump. So there was a lot of kind of internal, do you know what, that's too big, that's too intimidating, that's too challenging. And Ruth and Emma were kind of instrumental in helping me to get through that kind of, just little old me, little working class kid from Blackburn, who was born in a 2 up 2 down with an outside toilet. So I decided to apply for it, and Ruth did a really great job in kind of turning all of the car stories, challenge, action, results that you've done episodes on, into something that was actually kind of, it was able to breathe on the page, because the application was a CV and I think a couple of pages of A4 in terms of a personal statement. So she did a great job with that. I was really pleased with how it looked. I kind of thought, hey, if I get good feedback, that'd be real success. I'm not expecting to get shortlisted. But I was offered an interview, and that happened on the 30th of April. It was a Friday, 2021. So again, an online interview with a panel, and those are slightly odd. And I guess I knew two things at the end of it. One, I'd done an absolutely brilliant job on the presentation that we'd been asked to put together. And two, there were two questions that I thought, oh my God, I sounded like a complete and utter moron in answering those questions. And I knew that straight away.
Why was that? Was it that you weren't prepared, or that they were just questions that completely threw you, or was it the nerves of the day?
I think there's often focus on what you're good at, isn't it, in terms of your prep. And to be honest, I can be, when somebody asks me a challenging question, I can kind of speak out loud until my brain kicks into gear, and I can bring myself round to the answer that is now starting to form and starting to sound almost coherent in my head. So the thing I'm good at is presenting. So I think in terms of the prep for the interview, I kind of went, I'm a bit scared about that bit, so I'm going to focus on the bit I'm not scared about. And, I think I must have practiced that maybe well into the 30s, 30 times. Yes. So I knew it absolutely word for word. I knew every vocal intonation. I knew every up and down. I knew which sentence I was going to lead on a high and which I was going to lead on a low. I knew what my what my hand gestures would be, and that those hand gestures would fit in the frame on Teams. So I'd practiced all of that. I'd watched those back. I'd refined them. And I knew that, when they just said, can you give us a presentation? It was just like hitting the automatic button and it would happen. And I remember Nick saying, I'll give you the 30-second warning. And I thought, and the immediate reaction in my head was, you won't need to. Because I knew that was just going to go brilliantly. Yeah, I think when those two questions came up, they were questions that I just kind of went. One of them was, you're in a lift with Boris Johnson, who was Prime Minister at the time in the UK, whose big policy area was around levelling up, they called it. So essentially there's areas of the country, like where I grew up, which are deprived and areas that aren't. And levelling up was about trying to do something about that. So what would you say to Boris Johnson in those 2 minutes in the lift that would show that the university has really credible ideas, contributions to make to this agenda? And I just kind of went, oh, blah, blah, blah. And I vaguely remember kind of coming out with some nonsense in terms of, when you're thinking about the pitch, think about the audience and think about what they're most interested in. And all I could come up with was, he's only interested in himself. So I found that quite difficult to kind of situate an answer within what can the university do to show Boris Johnson is a really great guy when I know he's not. And, my politics are so different to that. So I think all of that kind of went through, went not quite through the conscious part of my brain, but went through all of the subconscious and fright centers and all of that sort of thing. And just kind of incoherent nonsense, I think, is probably the most polite description of that answer. But the other one that weirdly threw me was around postgraduate research students. And I know that community really well, and I know their challenges. One of the reasons why I'm working in this job is because I wanted a better experience for every PGR than I had. So the question was around, how do you help research students, all disciplines, really engage with enterprise? And obviously that enterprise word can take all sorts of very different definitions. Are we talking about them being entrepreneurial themselves? And I don't mean setting up businesses. I mean them actually having an entrepreneurial way of working in whatever career they go into. But I'd done loads of work collaboratively with loads of great people across the university, and for some reason, every single name of all of those people seeped out of my brain. And I remember one of the other panel coming in because they knew that work and going, it was them, and them, just to try and kind of settle me. I think it was kind of the question after the Boris Johnson question. And again, I that one, I kind of went, I had so much more I could have said then, in a more concise way that would have been much punchier and much more impactful in terms of the the interviewing panel being able to tick that criteria or give that a good score. So yeah, afterwards I didn't feel that great. I mean, luckily I'd arranged to have the rest of the day as leave, so the dog and I went out and he was able to listen to me kind of bleating about it and trying to get that off my chest.
So what happened next?
So while I was still out on the dog walk, because we went out for quite a long time to try and kind of unpack, Nick called at Teams call, and so I was listening. It went the way I was expecting, which was not to be given the job. And, the feedback it was like, that was definitely the best presentation that we saw. And kind of like, well, if it wasn't, I really don't know myself that well at all. But, there was someone else who delivered a much better all round piece. So that person was also internal, and I knew them. So they took up post as Director of Knowledge Exchange and Impact. That was in April. They took up the post in July, I think it was. I think it's around about the 19th of July. And I guess by that stage, that part of the interview was also almost like, when you scroll through YouTube and you scroll past things and it shows the same part of that clip, again and again. So that was kind of running. That part of the interview was almost running as a YouTube video on loop in my head whenever I wasn't completely distracted by something else. And I guess heading into the new academic year, kind of September time, that was getting worse and worse, almost like trying to find a time machine and go back and kind of like, now I have the answer, so surely you can just give me the job now. I've got a much better answer. Yeah, I couldn't stop that playlist, for want of a better word, and that affected me mentally, in terms of my mental health. That caused all sorts of bad things to happen. And I started looking at all sorts of other roles just to kind of try and run away from the situation. So I applied for a couple of jobs in London, got interviewed, didn't get those. Kind of that didn't help with the kind of your personal view of yourself, which at that time, when you hear you see that loop in your head and you have that nasty image of yourself on your shoulder that's going, you were awful, you were so rubbish, and the internal language was becoming more and more severe as time went by. So it was almost like, if you've ever seen the Spider-Man films, the Green Goblin character talking to them, the Green Goblin talking to the person who, when they're not the Green Goblin, it was actually quite a nice guy. It was really like that.
And had you struggled with anything like this before, or was this entirely new?
So I've used the counselling service when I was at Nottingham when my marriage fell apart. But in comparison, this was probably felt 10 times worse than that situation. I think, research impact, the impact universities can have in the world beyond academia is what universities are for. That is my heart-held, absolutely firm conviction, and nobody would ever argue me out of that, because it is a values belief. It is at the core of everything. And so that job was my perfect, absolutely perfect job, in terms of being able to have the influence to try and make that belief a reality. So I think to kind of miss out on that job felt like, if we're using a sporting analogy, we've just seen Rory McIlroy win the Masters. I think if he'd have missed that putt, it would have been the equivalent of that for me.
It's interesting because in academia, often when we talk about things like academic identity, we often talk about how academics are very, very tied to their sense of identity as being an academic. But what I think is really interesting here, that's often the same for many of us, whether we're in academia or academic adjacent roles, that we do tie a lot of our personal value to what we do for work. We spend so much time there, it's not surprising.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I mean, one of my previous roles was as head of careers, and the advice I've always given is chase something that's interesting and important to you. Don't chase salaries and position and that's what's important to me. I think that's what should be important to most people. And I think that's what brings ultimate satisfaction from a career.
So from that perspective, then, you tried to chase something that you thought would bring that satisfaction, but you hadn't been able to. And so that then put you in this situation where mentally you found that quite difficult to handle.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So, I've mentioned the dog, and most dog walks, I love walking the dog, but most dog walks became hell on earth because I just had time to see that YouTube loop again in vivid 8K, with all the, green goblin nastiness going on in my head. And part one of the dog walks I do takes you across a high bridge above a bypass, and that's the only time in my life I've thought of the only way to stop this is to stop my brain thinking, and the only way to stop my brain thinking is for it to be shut down.
So what changed to stop you from fixating? What helped you to move forward?
So that walk, the starting point was that walk across that bridge on that one dog walk. It was on the way out, and I had to go across the bridge on the way back. And so by the time I was coming back to that, I thought, I have to stop that suicidal thought happening again. I have to work out a way around that. And that, interestingly, as I said, I used counselling services before. Up to that point, I hadn't for this. It was almost like, because it was kind of my failure and what I did wrong, it was almost like, I don't know whether it was shame. I don't know whether it was being stupidly male. I don't know. I just couldn't tell people about it. It was almost, when people asked about the, as they do, the interview process, or if you saw a colleague from another university you hadn't seen in months on a Zoom call, have you been getting on? I'd tell them about it, but it was always like, their loss. I was almost kind of going, So what I did next was actually tell the people, I suppose, close to me in terms of I'm not well. Actually, this is I'm not great, and that I think was a surprise to everybody I told. And then, so I did then go to the counselling service. So went for quite a few appointments to try and work through it, and in the end, I used a whole range of different talking therapies. So went through the counselling service. Then the university provided me with external coaching. So I had that. And that particular coach, we used to meet at a country park in between our two homes. So we'd usually be able to do it in the open if it wasn't terrible weather. And, that was also great. You just being in the outside and being able to kind of talk it through and work out what next for me. I also took up mentoring. So I'm really grateful to Luke Windsor, who's our dean of the doctoral college here at Leeds, who I was given as a mentor. He was great. So I had chats with him around what next, what else might I do, still in that exploration process, but not being kind of exploring rather than kind of just jumping and hoping that the fire isn't as hot as the frying pan analogy. And then ultimately all of that enabled me to talk to Nick about it. So yeah, we'd had the feedback, and we'd had a long, he'd said on that dog walk discussion, we need to see each other again. We need to talk about this in more detail. And in some ways I'd kind of gone, I'm not ready, psychologically I wasn't ready for all of that. So we did have another conversation about 2 months later that was feedback, but actually that was while I was starting to go down rather than coming back up. So after the counselling and the coaching, I arranged to see Nick again, and we saw each other twice. And I'm really grateful because, and people might say why, and you just kind of think he's so busy. He has so many other people's concerns at his door, and we had 2 sessions pretty close together, which is that were over an hour in length. Now, anybody who's tried to get a DVC or a PVC for more than an hour, 2 weeks apart, I was being significantly prioritized by him. And I absolutely knew that during those conversations that, all he cared about at that moment in time was me, which I think was one of the things I kind of needed to hear, because I felt like I'd let him down as well as me. So for him to want to invest, for him to want me to get to a point where whatever I did next was the right thing for me, not just the right thing for the university. Was very much I knew I was coming way back up that curve as a result of those conversations. So that, a whole range of talking with lots of different people and actually being honest about the grief, really, essentially, that I was going through.
If you don't mind me asking, what was Nick's reaction? Had he realised how much this had affected you?
I think he really, interesting in those conversations, he didn't try to kind of ask questions about why haven't we had these conversations sooner. It's kind of like, I'm not going to go back and look at what might have been, a non-optimal way through this depression, and remind you of that, so I think he handled that amazingly well. He focused on me, he focused on where I was right at that moment, and he listened, and he, interestingly, often counselling is about that surprising question that unlocks a way for you to think about something. I know he's not a trained counsellor, but he really unlocked a number of questions that really made me go, I really need to reflect on that. And the reflection on that will be a positive experience, not the reflection I'd been doing where I'd just been looking at the reflection and going, that's horrible. I can't thank him enough, to be honest.
And I guess that's a testament as well to the importance of good leadership, I guess, good support within universities. I mean, I think one of the things that's come out of this is you were able to utilise the support within the university to help you move past that.
Yeah, I mean, everybody who, I've already mentioned Luke, Emma and Ruth heard this a lot and provided support. Caroline, who's Emma's boss, funding the coaching and the coach themselves. The people at the counselling service I met, I had the same counsellor all the way through those sessions. We sometimes criticise universities for not having things, but actually when they do have a whole range of things, when I worked in the corporate sector, counselling would have been 30-minute conversation by phone with somebody, and that might be the limit of what you were offered as part of the employee benefits package. Well, I don't know how many hours I went through actually in terms of counselling with that person, and the care and the professionalism of all of those people was just,
Yeah. And I think it's a useful reminder as well, and something that's come up quite a lot in discussions with various people since the last episode on failure, is the importance of talking it through with other people. Because I think so often, because we have these notions of identity and excellence, and we're I think universities are an environment where people are very often very tough on themselves. People feel like they can't talk through failure because then that admits somehow that they have failed or that things haven't gone the way they wanted.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, yeah, it is about talking it through. There aren't any solutions out of that, certainly from my perspective. You know, the different conversations brought different things. You know, the counselling was about getting to a stage where I could start to formulate actions. The coaching was about the formulation of those actions. The mentoring was about the exploration of some of the things I thought about during those two earlier stages. So yeah, they were all different stages, but all just talking and actually talking to a range of people, but to get their input, not in a kind of, oh, you should do, or this would be right for you, or this will fix you. Just different perspectives on that problem. And having so many people, you know, everybody, one of the places action learning that we use a lot, action learning comes from some work that was done in the early years of the National Health Service, where there was a recognition that it isn't the consultant that has the answers. It's all of the team around. You know, if there's a complex case, all of the, you know, the nurses, what's happening, what are you seeing, because you see them more often, what's the physio seeing, what's the, you know, all of those multidisciplinary experts need to be brought together to kind of try and find the right way forward in that case. So that I think was really important for me, that kind of multidisciplinary, almost expertise approach and perspectives. Yeah. And obviously talking about it at home as well.
Looking back on the whole experience, the whole process, what would you say you've learned from this? And perhaps if you were to go back, or if something similar were to happen to you in the future, how do you think you'd handle things differently, if at all?
So I think, you know, I think there's a simple one, and I've probably hinted at it in terms of describing it, is not to be, you know, when a challenge is coming up that you want the thing from the challenge, whether that's an interview, whether it's a funding application, whatever it is that you can't just focus on the thing you're good at. You know, you do have to put really more of the time into the thing you're not good at. So if you know, if it's a funding application and you know you're rubbish about writing about responsible research and innovation, that's the thing you need to focus on, not leave it to the last minute. And I think, you know, I did that. I focused on the thing I was good at and left. You know, I did have a mock interview with somebody from outside the university, and I knew that, you know, the mock interview didn't actually go that great, but I had so little time left to try and fix that I think I almost did the head in the sand approach. Well, it might be better next Friday. When the real interview happens. So I think it's kind of really planning through what is it that you need to focus on, and it's the thing that you're likely to be less good at that is the thing you need to focus on to really raise the whole thing, you know, the interview or the application or the paper or whatever it is.
And to ask a tough question, say you went through a similar process again and didn't get the job, how would you handle it differently in that case?
Well, I've had that experience because the role came up again. It actually came up twice. The first time was really in the kind of deep depression stage, so I didn't apply for it at that point, and they didn't appoint. So it was re-advertised again. So I was interviewed again on the 28th of November 2022, and yeah, I think I did go, I really have to focus. And you know, the presentation, they might have a different title, but it'll be something similar. Yeah, and it was. So it was kind of like, right, tweak that, get it out of the way. I know I can, with about 2 or 3 practices, I'll be back at the press the button and it'll just happen. And then the rest of the time was, right, I really need to crowdsource potential questions from people who've been in that. And also there was a benefit here because this third time around, they were using a headhunter this time. So again, I was able to kind of tap into what the headhunter's view of what might come up. They are trying to get them to say yes to somebody they've recommended to be on the short list. So that was a much more pleasurable experience. And I kind of I had all sorts of notes on potential questions that they could ask, and I took those in. This was a face-to-face interview this time, so I was able to have them on the table, and it was, it felt much more kind of like that process that you don't like, but you feel more comfortable with. Being interviewed by teams we train by teams, but we're not being interviewed by teams. So I knew I'd done the prep. I couldn't have done any more for that. And when I closed my notes and kind of left the interview, I thought, if they don't give it me this time, it's through no fault of the interview process. I could not have done any better with any of the questions without lying. And
what was that experience of going through it all again like?
I really enjoyed that, actually, bizarrely. I remember, as I was walking to the door, Nick, who was chair of the panel, we got out the door and he said, "Well done." And he didn't say it kind of outright, but he sort of winked, and I thought, yeah, much better than last time. Yes, I know. And then he went off to get the next candidate, and I went to the next stage of the interview, which was to meet a few of the other directors that report to him directly, who obviously I know anyway, but you have to go through the process. And really enjoyed it. It was, I set my stall out, and the feedback was good. It's just on the day there was somebody better, and I get on really well with that person, Sarah Hall, no relation. So I get on really well with Sarah. I think she is a really great appointment. I work well with her and the team that she's putting around her. And I feel happy. I'm glad I did it again. I think if I'd have just gone that third time around, I'm not going for it. Yeah, that's past me. But now if it came up again, if Sarah left, I might not go for it this time. All of that exploration and all those conversations over that year and a half and the various interviews made me realise that what I do is the thing I love the most.
What for me becomes clear is that when it comes to failure, there's two different ways that you can prepare for anything. There's a kind of practical preparation, the practicing your presentation again and again, practicing questions, but there's also the kind of emotional preparation as well. And it sounds to me like that last time around, you were both practically and emotionally prepared, and that's what really changed things that time.
Yeah, I think it might sound like a cliche, but having gone through it once and it feeling that ultimately horrible, and going through that horrible almost 9 months, I think that kind of made me kind of realize that it doesn't matter what the answer is. I have to look after myself. It doesn't matter what the answer. If it's yes, great. If it's no, then I'm still doing a job that I love.
Yeah.
And with colleagues that I really appreciate, have a huge amount of respect for, in a university, as I said, as an alumni elite, I love the place.
So just to round off quickly then, if someone else was going through a similar experience, what would your main piece of advice be for them?
So I think if you've gone through, the process and you're starting to notice it affecting you, then I think the first thing to do is not to close in. And I did that. It was the worst thing I did was kind of sucking it all into the center and kind of go, I can fix this. yes, you can fix it, but you probably will need to fix it with the help of others.
Yeah.
And I think the prep beforehand will be is about working out who are those others that you're going to reach out to. If the answer is no, and if it then starts affecting you negatively in your mental health, knowing all of those places and acting on them as soon as you feel that trigger. Certainly don't leave it to the trigger I left it to.
So thank you so much for sharing your experience, Jed. It's been a really interesting and at times emotional discussion, but really interesting to hear your experience and how you managed that over time. If you've listened to this episode and you'd like to share your experience too, please do get in touch. We would love to hear from you. And as I noted at the beginning of the episode, if the issues raised in this episode concern you, you can access support and resources in the show notes. So thank you again so much, Jed. It's been an absolute pleasure, and we'll see you again next week for another episode of Research Culture Uncovered.
Thanks, Taryn, and I hope the conversation's been useful for people out there.
Thanks for listening to the Research Culture Uncovered podcast. Please subscribe so you never miss out on our brand new episodes. And if you're enjoying the discussions, give us some love by dropping a 5-star rating and written review, as it helps other research culturists find us. And please share with a friend and show them how to subscribe. Thanks for listening, and here's to you and your research culture.